Dionysius, the geographer, another writer of the Augustan age, says that the rites of Bacchus were celebrated in Britain. Footnote. Periget, 5, 565. And Strabo, on the authority of Artemidorus, who wrote a century before Christ, asserts that in an island close to Britain, probably the Isle of Mona, where the Druids held their principal seat, Ceres and Proserpine were venerated with rites similar to those of Samothracia. Footnote. Letter 4. Bryant, who traced all the ancient religions, principally on the basis of etymology, to traditions of the deluge and the worship of the patriarch Noah, conceived, of course, that Druidism was but a part of this universal cult. Footnote. Analysis of ancient mythology. Drummond says of him, Mr. Bryant was a man possessed of much learning and talent, but his etymologies are generally untenable. Origins, Volume 3, page 191. Faber, who followed in the footsteps of his learned predecessor, adopted the same hypothesis and held the doctrine that the Druids were addicted to what he denominated archite worship, or the worship of Noah, and that all their religious rites referred to the deluge, death and immortality being typified by the confinement of the patriarch in the ark and his subsequent emergence from it into a new and renovated world, the symbol of the future life. Footnote. Pagan idolatry. It will be evident from the description already given of the Druidical initiations, as portrayed by Dr. Oliver, that he concurred to a great extent in the views of Bryant and Faber. Stukely, one of the most learned of English antiquarians, believed that the Druids were addicted to tree and serpent worship, and he adduces as evidence of the truth of this theory the megalithic monuments of Stonehenge and Avebury, in the arrangement of whose stones he thought that he had traced a serpentine form. On the contrary, Mr. Ferguson, footnote, Old Stone Monuments, scoffs, in language not always temperate, at the views of Stukely, and not only denies the serpentine form of the stone remains in England, as described by that antiquary, but repudiates the hypothesis that the Druids ever erected or had any connection with stone temples or monuments in any part of the world. But as Ferguson adduces nothing but negative arguments in proof of his assertion, and as he even casts some doubt upon the existence of Druids at all in Britain, his views are by no means satisfactory. He has sought to demolish a palace, but he has not attempted to build even a hovel in its place. Repudiating all other theories, he has offered none of his own. If the Druids did not erect the stone monuments of Britain, who did? Until the contrary is conclusively proved, we have but little hesitation in attributing them to the Druids. But we need not enter into this discussion, which pertains more properly to the province of archaeology than of Freemasonry. Some writers have held that the Druids were sun worshippers, and that the adoration of the solar orb constituted the national religion of the ancient Britons. Hence, these theorists are inclined to believe that Stonehenge and Avebury were really observatories, where the worshippers of the sun might behold his rising, his diurnal course, and his setting. Mr. Davies, in his Celtic Researches, and in his Mythology and Rites of the British Druids, maintains that there was among them a mutilated tradition of the Noahic deluge. Footnote: British Druids, page 95. As there was among all heathen nations. The legend was similar to that of the flood of Deucalion, and was derived from Samothrace and the East, having been brought by a colony from one nation to another, and preserved without interruption. Footnote: Ibid, page 99. Who, the supreme god of the Druids, he therefore supposes to have been identical with Noah, and he bestows upon him the various attributes that were distributed among the different gods of the more prolific mythology of the Greeks and Romans, all of which, with Bryant and Faber, he considers were allusive to sun worship and to the catastrophe of the deluge. He therefore asserts that the Helio-Archite god of the Britons, the great Hu, was a pantheon, a collection of deities, who under his several titles and attributes comprehended the group of superior gods whom the Greeks and other refined nations separated and arranged in distinct personages. Footnote: Ibid, page 126. In propounding his theory that the Druids were of Eastern origin, and that they had brought from that source their religion and their rites, Mr. Davies has been sustained by the opinions of more recent scholars, though they have traced the birthplace to a more distant region than the island of Samothracia. It is now very generally believed that the Druids were Buddhists, and that they came into Britain with the great tide of emigration from Asia, which brought the Aryan race westward into Europe. If this be true, the religion of India must have greatly degenerated in the course of its migration. It is admitted that the Druids cultivated the art of magic, and in their rites were accustomed to sacrifice human victims, both of which practices were repugnant to the philosophic spirit of Buddhism. The fact is that, notwithstanding the authority of the Welsh bards and the scanty passages in Caesar, Tacitus, and a few other Roman writers, we are entirely at sea in reference to everything connected with the religious system of Druidism. Almost all on this mysterious subject is guesswork and conjecture, extravagant theories, the only foundation of which is in the imaginations of their framers, and bold assertions, for the truth of which no competent authority can be given. Much of the confusion of ideas in respect to the customs and manners of the ancient Britons has arisen from the ignorance of the old writers. in supposing that the inhabitants of Britain at the time of the Roman invasion and long before were a homogeneous race. The truth is that the island was inhabited by two very distinct races. Those on the coast, derived from the opposite shores of Gaul, Germany, and Scandinavia, were a people who had made some progress in civilization. The interior of the island was populated by the original natives, who were a very uncivilized and even barbarous race, and it was among these that the Druidical religion prevailed and its mystical and inhuman rites were practiced. Mr. Ferguson, in his elaborate work on tree and serpent worship, sustains this view. He says, "From whatever point of view the subject is looked at, it seems almost impossible to avoid the conclusion that there were two races in England, an older and less civilized people, who in the time of the Romans had already been driven by the Celts into the fastnesses of the Welsh hills, and who may have been serpent worshippers and sacrificers of human victims, and that the ecumenical Romans confounded the two." Footnote: Tree and Serpent Worship, page 29. He is, however, in error in supposing that the Romans were ignorant of this fact, for Caesar distinctly alludes to it. He says in his Gallic War that the interior part of Britain was inhabited by those who were natives of the island, thus clearly distinguishing the inhabitants of the interior from those who dwelt on the coast and who, he states, had passed over from Belgium. In another place he speaks of them as a rude and barbarous race, who in one of their embassies to him described themselves as a savage and unpolished people, wholly unacquainted with Roman customs. In speaking of the ancient Gauls, M. Thierry, in his history of that people, makes the following remarks, every one of which may be equally attributed to the ancient Britons. He says, "When we attentively examine the character of the facts concerning the religious belief of the Gauls, we are enabled to recognize two systems of ideas, two bodies of symbols and superstitions altogether distinct, in a word, two religions. One of these is altogether sensible, derived from the adoration of the phenomena of nature, and by its forms and by its literal development it reminds us of the polytheism of the Greeks. The other is founded upon a material pantheism, mysterious, metaphysical, and sacerdotal, and presents the most astonishing conformity with the religions of the East. This last has received the name of Druidism from the Druids who were its founders and priests." Footnote: Histoire des Gaulois, Tome 2, page 73.